Hi everyone. For this project, I conducted a mini ethnography comparing thrift culture and sneaker/hype culture to look at how people use fashion to express identity and social belonging. I focused on two main types of spaces: thrift stores and sneaker/hype retail stores. In each space, I observed how people interacted with clothing and with each other, and I also conducted field interviews to better understand how people think about their style choices. Rather than looking at fashion as just clothing, this project treats fashion as a social language, something people use to communicate who they are, what they value, and where they belong. I'll walk through the background, the data I collected, and what I found by comparing these two spaces. So the main question guiding this project was pretty straightforward. I wanted to understand how people use fashion to express identity and belonging, and how that looks different depending on the cultural space they're in. More specifically, I asked how this plays out in thrift stores compared to sneaker or hype focused retail spaces. These spaces attract very different kinds of shoppers, and they also seem to have different values around clothing. Instead of assuming fashion, assu- Instead of assuming fashion means the same thing everywhere, I approached each space as its own cultural environment, with its own norms, expectations, and meanings attached to style. This question shaped what I paid attention to during observations and what I asked people during interviews. Before getting into my own data, it's important to briefly talk about the cultural context of these two spaces. Thrift stores are often associated with ideas like affordability, sustainability, creativity, and individuality. People tend to browse slowly, mix different styles, and look for items that feel unique or personal rather than trendy. Thrifting is often framed as intentional, not just about saving money, but about expressing values. Sneaker or hype retail spaces, on the other hand, tend to emphasize brands, exclusivity, and cultural knowledge. These spaces are often tied to streetwear culture, limited releases, and online communities, where knowing what's rare or authentic matters. Because these spaces operate differently, they create different expectations for how clothing should be worn, talked about, and valued. Keeping this context in mind helps make sense of the patterns that show up later in observations and interviews. To help guide how I interpreted what I was seeing and hearing, I used a few key ideas from existing research. One body of research looks at thrift culture, thrift shopping as a form of identity work, where people use secondhand clothing to express creativity, values, or resistance to mainstream consumer culture. Another set of studies looks at sneaker culture as a participatory culture, where belonging is built through shared knowledge, community recognition, and authenticity rather than just owning expensive items. I also drew on research that views fashion more broadly as a way for people to experiment with identity, almost like trying on different versions of themselves depending on the space they're in. These ideas help me move beyond just describing what I saw and towards actually analyzing what those behaviors might mean. I didn't just include these sources as background information, I actively used them while doing fieldwork and analysis. The research on thrift culture helped me pay attention to things like how people talked about uniqueness, creativity, and sustainability when describing their clothing choices. The work on sneaker culture helped me recognize that conversations about brands, releases, and authenticity weren't just about shoes, but about knowledge and belonging within a community. And the identity focused research helped me frame fashion as something flexible, something people use to signal who they are depending on the situation they're in. Together, these lenses shaped how I observed behavior, asked interview questions, and later made sense of the patterns I found. Before collecting my data, I developed a few hypotheses based on the research and what I expected to see in these different spaces. First, I expected that people in both thrift and sneaker environments would use fashion as a way to communicate identity and signal belonging, even if they did it differently. I also hypothesized that thrift shoppers would be more likely to emphasize personal meaning, creativity, or sustainability when talking about their clothing choices. In contrast, I expect sneaker or hype shoppers to place more of an importance on brand recognition, rarity, and cultural knowledge within sneaker communities. These hypotheses gave me a framework to compare what people said in interviews and what I observed in each retail space. To answer my research question, I used a combination of participant observation and semi structured interviews. I spent time observing behavior in both thrift stores and sneaker or hype retail spaces, paying attention to how people browsed, talked about clothing, and interacted with others in the store. In addition to observation, I conducted several semi structured interviews with participants of different ages and backgrounds, asking them about their style choices, influences, and how they think about fashion. I, I also took field notes during observations and compared those notes with interview responses to look for patterns across both settings. Using both observation and interviews helped me understand not just what people said about fashion, but how they actively engage with it in real spaces. I'll start with what I observed in thrift store settings. One of the first things I noticed was that shoppers tended to spend a lot of time browsing. People moved slowly through racks, often checking items carefully and comparing different price pieces rather than grabbing things quickly. I also observed that clothing choices were less about matching trends and more about finding something unique. Shoppers often mixed styles, colors, and eras that weren't that and there wasn't much emphasis on brand names. Social interactions in thrift stores were usually casual and collaborative. Friends commented on each other's finds, gave opinions, or shopped together. Overall, the thrift store felt like a space where experimentation and individuality were encouraged through the way people interacted with clothing. In the interviews with thrift shoppers, a lot of what people said lined up with what I observed in the stores. Several participants talked about thrifting as a way to express individuality and avoid dressing like everyone else. One participant explained that they liked thrifting because it felt more personal and intentional than shopping at mainstream stores. Creativity came up frequently, especially the idea of putting together outfits that felt unique or meaningful rather than trendy. Sustainability was also mentioned by multiple interviewees, not as a main motivation, but an added benefit of shopping secondhand. Overall, thrift shoppers describe their clothing choices as something tied to personal values and self-expression, not just convenience or price. When I moved into sneaker and hype retail spaces, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Shoppers often talked about specific brands, models, or upcoming releases, and conversations frequently included references to rarity, authenticity, or resale value. I observed that outfits were usually more coordinated and brand focused, with an emphasis on recognizable sneakers and streetwear pieces. Clothing seemed to be intentionally styled to be seen and recognized by others who were familiar with sneaker culture. Social interactions in these spaces often revolved around shared knowledge. People asked each other questions, compared shoes, or commented on what someone was wearing in a way that showed expertise. Overall, the sneaker and hype stores felt like cultural spaces where knowing the language and symbols of sneaker culture mattered just as much as the clothing itself. In interviews with sneaker/hype shoppers, people consistently emphasized the importance of knowledge and recognition within sneaker culture. Several participants explained that knowing brands, releases, or sneaker history helps signal credibility and respect within the community. One participant mentioned that if you really know sneakers, other people can tell right away. Rarity and authenticity also came up often, especially when talking about what makes certain sneakers valuable or meaningful. Social influence played a role as well. with interviewees referencing friends, social media, or online community as places where sneaker culture is learned and reinforced. Overall, sneaker shoppers describe fashion as something that communicates belonging and status through shared cultural knowledge. When I put the observations and interviews together, a few clear patterns emerged. First, the data supported the idea that people in both thrift and sneaker spaces use clothing as a way to communicate identity and belonging. However, the way they did this depended heavily on the cultural setting. In thrift stores, both interviews and observations emphasize creativity, personal meaning, and values like sustainability. Clothing functioned as a way to stand out by being different rather than by following trends. In sneaker and hype spaces, identity was communicated through brand knowledge, authenticity, and cultural awareness. Being recognized as someone who knows sneakers appeared to be an important part of belonging in that space. These findings suggest that fashion doesn't carry a single meaning on its own, but instead takes on different meanings depending on the social and cultural environment where it's worn. Like any small-scale ethnography project, this study had its own few limitations that are important to acknowledge. First, the number of interviews and observation sites was limited, which means that these findings aren't meant to represent everyone who shops in thrift or sneaker spaces. There's also the possibility of social desirability bias, where people may describe their fashion choices in a way to sound more intentional or socially acceptable during interviews. In addition, different store environments and time constraints may have influenced who was present and how people behaved while I was observing. Recognizing these limitations helps place the findings in context and highlights areas where future research could build on this work. To conclude, this project shows that while fashion is often talked about as a form of self-expression, the meaning of that expression depends heavily on the cultural space people are in. In thrift settings, fashion tended to be framed around creativity, individuality, and personal values, while in sneaker and hype spaces, it was more closely tied to brand knowledge, authenticity, and community recognition. Even though both groups used clothing to signal belonging, they did so using very different cultural cues. This comparison highlights how fashion operates as a social language that changes across environments, rather than having a single fixed meaning. Overall, this ethnography approach helps show how everyday spaces like retail stores can reveal broader patterns about identity and cultural belonging. That's about it. Thank you.